Asha walked into the tall office building in Bale with her head held high, even though she wore simple, plain clothes. She didn't have designer shoes or a fancy bag. She was a widow and a single mother, doing her best to make ends meet. The panel of interviewers barely looked up when she entered. One of them whispered, loud enough for her to hear, "Just another village woman wasting our time." A few of them even chuckled. Asha didn't react. She simply handed over her resume and sat quietly. They ignored it. They didn't bother to read her file. They were too focused on her clothes, her quiet presence, her lack of makeup. But then something changed. A young intern, maybe no older than 22, reached for the resume on the corner of the desk. He began to read, and his eyes widened. "Wait," he said, interrupting the laughter. "She was operations head at Global Reach International?" The room went silent. He continued, his voice trembling a little. "She managed emergency relief across East Africa. She coordinated logistics for 5 countries. She trained hundreds of staff." Now everyone looked at Asha. The HR manager scrambled for the resume. "Why did you leave?" one of them finally asked. Asha looked up calmly. "My husband died. I had to raise my son alone." There was nothing more to say. They suddenly saw the woman before them, not a village woman, but a leader. They begged her to take the job. But now it was her turn to decide. Nia sat in the waiting room, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her folder. She wasn't used to big offices like that. The white walls, polished floors, and people walking fast in sharp suits made her feel small. But she kept reminding herself, "You've been through worse. You can do this." When they called her name, she walked in quietly and greeted the panel in a soft voice. She stammered a little. "Gee, good morning." Her eyes dropped to the floor as a few of the interviewers exchanged amused glances. One of them raised an eyebrow. Another leaned toward a colleague and whispered something, and they both smiled like they knew everything about her already. "Can you even handle this kind of job?" one of them asked, not even looking up from their phone. "You seem a bit unprepared," another added, with a fake polite smile. Nia's heart sank, but she stayed calm. She wasn't surprised. This had happened before. People always saw her quiet voice and nervous hands, and assumed she was weak or simple. What they didn't know, what they never expected, was what was in her resume. It sat unopened on the desk until one older board member, silent till now, picked it up out of curiosity. He started reading. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. Slowly, his expression changed. "She was a lecturer at Nairobi University," he said, loud enough to cut through the whispers. Everyone turned. "She has a master's in linguistics, and she's fluent in 5 languages: English, Swahili, French, Arabic, and German." The room froze. Another member grabbed the resume to double-check. Someone cleared their throat, suddenly sitting up straighter. "Wait, she worked on translation projects with the African Union?" Nia looked up, her voice steady this time. "Yes. I also helped train interpreters in refugee camps." The board member who had first spoken stood up, his voice firm but kind. "This is the woman we've been searching for, not just because of her qualifications, because she understands what it means to fight through silence, to be overlooked, and still stand strong." No one laughed now. No one dared. Nia didn't smile, but there was a light in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for how she looked, not for how she spoke, but for who she truly was. And this time, they didn't choose her out of pity. They chose her because they finally understood the value of quiet strength. Zawadi walked into the office building with calm steps and her head held high. She had been here before, not as a guest, not as a job applicant, but as a janitor. Years ago, she used to clean these same floors early in the morning, wearing a worn-out uniform and carrying a mop. Most people never even looked at her. If they did, it was only to ask her to move out of the way. Now she was back, dressed simply but neatly, holding a file of documents in her hand. She walked into the interview room and sat down quietly. The panel barely glanced at her. One man leaned back and sighed. "You worked here before?" he asked with a smirk. "Yes," Zawadi replied calmly. "Doing what exactly?" another asked, flipping through her resume without opening it. "Cleaning," she said. Someone snorted. "So now you want to be a consultant? People like you waste our time," another said under his breath, not even trying to hide his tone. Zawadi didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply nodded toward the resume. "Please read it," she said softly. They weren't interested, until one woman at the end of the table decided to take a proper look. Slowly, her expression began to change. "She studied business strategy at the University of Cape Town," the woman said, sounding surprised. "And she's worked with 3 international consulting firms?" Another grabbed the papers, flipping through the documents. "She helped redesign operations for a logistics company in Kenya, increased their efficiency by 40%. Now the room was quiet. Zawadi looked up, meeting their eyes for the first time. "I used to clean these halls before the sun came up. I saved my salary, studied at night, applied for scholarships, and traveled when I had the chance." I never forgot where I started, but I always knew where I was going. At that moment, the CEO, who had just entered and stood quietly at the back, recognized her. His eyes widened. Years ago, he used to walk past her every morning. He never said a word, but now he stepped forward. This woman used to greet me every single morning, even when I didn't respond. And now she's sitting here more qualified than half this room. He turned to the panel and said, "She's not here to ask for a chance. She earned it." Zawadi didn't smile, but the strength in her silence said everything. For years, they had looked down on her. Now, they had no choice but to look up. Fatu stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the faded blazer she had borrowed from her cousin. It was too big at the shoulders and the skirt had a tiny rip near the hem, but it was the best she could do. She had spent her last money on transport to the city for this interview. There was no money left for new clothes, makeup, or even lunch. But she had hope and a resume full of hard work. When she walked into the office, heads turned, but not in a kind way. One person on the panel raised an eyebrow. Another whispered, "Did she come here straight from the market?" There was laughter. One of them even muttered, "These village girls never learn." Fatu sat down quietly, trying to ignore the stares. She had heard worse. She had been through worse. Still, it hurt. They looked at her clothes, not her eyes. They judged her appearance, not her mind. "Why should we take you seriously when you couldn't even dress properly for an interview?" one of them said, pretending to smile. Fatu didn't reply. She simply slid her resume across the table. One of the women rolled her eyes but picked it up anyway. Seconds passed. Then the room began to change. "She graduated top of her class at Makerere University," the woman read aloud, her voice suddenly quieter. "She was on the dean's list every year." Another person leaned over to take a look. "Wait, she worked in Geneva? With the World Health Organization?" Now the panel was silent. "She's published in 2 international journals," someone else added. "And she speaks 4 languages." Fatu sat still, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She wasn't surprised. She knew her worth. She knew what she had achieved while others were busy making assumptions. One man cleared his throat. We didn't realize. You're exactly the kind of person we're looking for." Another added, "We'd be honored to offer you the position." But Fatu stood up. She looked at them one by one, not with anger, but with clarity. "You saw my clothes and decided I had nothing to offer. You laughed at me before you even knew my name. I didn't walk here just to be insulted, and then accepted like a second thought." She picked up her folder, adjusted her cousin's old blazer, and walked to the door. "I'm not desperate," she said without turning around. "And I'm not for sale." They called after her, but she didn't look back. Outside, the sun was shining. She had no job offer now, but she had her dignity, and that was something they couldn't measure on paper. Lulu walked into the office with quiet confidence. She had received the interview invitation a week ago, and although something about it felt off, she still showed up. She wore her best clothes, not flashy, but clean and neat. Her natural hair was tied back, and she held her resume in a slim folder. The receptionist gave her a long look before asking, "You're here for that interview?" Lulu just nodded politely. She was led into a sleek conference room where 4 people sat behind a large table, all dressed sharp, all smiling a little too hard. They shook her hand with forced politeness, barely making eye contact. "Thanks for coming," one of them said, with a tone that didn't match the words. They asked a few shallow questions, barely listening to her answers. They kept looking at each other, smirking as if sharing a private joke. Then one of the managers leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Let's be honest," he said with a smirk. "We all know this interview is just to meet the diversity target. We don't need charity cases in this company." The others chuckled quietly. They thought she'd break. They thought she'd shrink, maybe even leave the room crying. But Lulu didn't blink. She calmly opened her folder and handed over a copy of her resume. "Please read it," she said, her voice even. The smirks disappeared as one woman actually began to scan the page. Her eyes widened. "Wait, she founded Eltech Solutions," she asked aloud. Another grabbed the paper. "Is this a joke?" he asked, flipping through the pages. "Eltech, the tech startup that was just acquired last month, for $2 million, Lulu replied, looking them straight in the eyes. "Yes, that was my company. I built it from scratch, ran it for 5 years, and sold it last month. I didn't apply here because I needed the job. I was curious to see how companies like yours treat people who don't fit your mold." The room went quiet. "I've worked with international clients, led a team across 3 countries, and been invited to speak at global conferences. But the moment I walked in here, you had already decided who I was, based on my name, my face, maybe even my skin." The manager who made the charity case comment stared at the table now. No one could look her in the eye. Lulu stood, picked up her folder, and smiled not out of anger but out of power. "I came here on my terms. And now, I'm leaving on them too." She walked out, leaving behind the silence, the shame, and the fake smiles. Outside, she took a deep breath. She didn't need anyone to open doors for her. She had already built her own. Tandy stood at the edge of the city bus stop, holding her small handbag and her niece's photo tucked safely in her pocket. The city was loud and fast, so different from her quiet village. But she had made a promise. On her sister's last day, lying weak and tired, she had grabbed Tandy's hand and said, "Please raise my daughter well. Find a good job. Give her a future." Tandy promised, and now she was here. She had borrowed a skirt and blouse from her neighbor and wore simple sandals. Her accent was strong, her voice soft, but her heart was steady. When she walked into the office for the interview, some of the panelists glanced at her clothes and exchanged quick looks. One man smirked. Another whispered something under his breath. "Next time, try to dress more professionally," one woman said sharply. "And maybe work on your English a bit," added another. Tandy felt the sting but said nothing. She had faced worse than unkind words. She handed over her resume with both hands and waited. At first, no one seemed to care, until one woman at the far end of the table picked up the file and began to read. Her eyes moved slowly down the page, then stopped. She read something again. Her hand covered her mouth, and tears suddenly filled her eyes. She looked up at Tandy. "Were you a volunteer nurse during the flood in Manafwa 2 years ago?" she asked, voice trembling. Tandy nodded. "Yes. I helped where I could." The woman stood up slowly. "You carried a little boy through waist-deep water to the rescue van. Do you remember that?" Tandy thought for a moment, then nodded again. "He was crying for his mother. I didn't know if she was alive, but I couldn't leave him." The woman's voice broke. "That boy was my son. I never got the chance to thank you. I didn't know your name until now." The entire room went quiet. The panel looked stunned. The woman turned to the others. "You're all worried about her clothes and her accent, but she's the reason my child is alive." She turned back to Tandy. "We've been looking for someone with heart, skill, and courage. You've already proved you have all three." She didn't wait for a vote. "I'm offering you the senior medical coordinator role." On the spot, Tandy couldn't speak. Her hands shook slightly as she held her niece's photo in her pocket. All she could think was, "I kept my promise, sister. I did it." The same people who had looked down on her now watched with respect. She didn't need to change who she was to deserve a place. She had always been enough. Kamaria sat quietly in the waiting area, dressed in a plain gray blouse and simple shoes. Her hair was tied back neatly, her face calm. No one in the office recognized her. Not the receptionist, not the people walking past, not the young HR staff whispering nearby. A few years ago, her face had been in newspapers and business magazines. Now, she was just another applicant. Back then, she was the CEO of a multinational tech company. She led major deals, traveled across continents, and gave speeches on innovation. But then came the scandal. Something she didn't cause, something she tried to fight, but the damage was done. She was forced to resign. And after that, she disappeared from the spotlight. Now, she just needed a job to keep going. She applied for a mid-level project manager role. Nothing fancy. Just enough to survive. When she walked into the interview room, a few people looked up with bored eyes. One man glanced at her form and scoffed. "You seem very confident for someone applying at this level." Another chuckled, maybe a little too confident. They didn't even try to hide their sarcasm. Kamaria didn't argue. She didn't brag. She simply passed her resume forward. One of the women picked it up, flipped through the pages without interest, until her eyes landed on a certain line. Her face changed. She looked closer. "You were CEO at Nexus Tech Group?" The room shifted. Someone else grabbed the resume. "Wait, you led the company during the international expansion into Europe and South Asia?" Another scanned the next page. "There's a reference letter here, from the president's office?" "Yes," Kamaria said softly. "I worked closely with the ministry on a national tech initiative. That letter was sent after the program ended." Now the silence was heavy. "Why are you applying for this job?" one of them asked, stunned. Kamaria looked at them calmly. "Because I need work. Not a title. Not attention. Just work that matters." One of the HR staff who had laughed before looked down, ashamed. The woman holding the resume finally spoke. "You don't belong in this chair. You belong at the top of the table. We treated you like no one, and you've already done more than most of us ever will." Kamaria stood up, gently took back her resume, and smiled. "I didn't come here to be praised. I came to see how people treat someone they think has nothing." She walked to the door, then paused. "Thank you for showing me exactly why I no longer want to work here." She didn't need their job. She had already rebuilt herself once, and she could do it again. Outside, she stepped into the sun, head high. She may have fallen, but she never stopped being the woman who once built an empire. Nabira sat in the lobby, hands folded in her lap, waiting for her turn. She had come all the way from her small hometown, where people spoke mostly Swahili and life moved slower. She had worked hard to reach this point. The bus ride to the city was long, the streets unfamiliar, but she didn't let that shake her. When they finally called her in, she stood, straightened her modest blouse, and walked into the room. The panel of interviewers barely looked up. One of them asked her name, and as she answered in clear but accented English, they exchanged amused glances. One man leaned back in his chair and laughed. English-speaking clients won't understand that. Another added, maybe she should apply for a local radio station instead. A few laughed under their breath, as if she wasn't even in the room. Nabira heard them, but she stayed calm. She had heard these kinds of comments before, growing up. People thought her voice made her small, her accent made her uneducated, but they had no idea who she really was. She quietly placed her resume on the table. One woman picked it up, just to be polite, flipping through the first page with little interest. Then she paused. "She's a certified interpreter?" she said, her tone changing. "Fluent in English, Swahili, French, Arabic." Another person leaned forward, now reading over her shoulder. "She's worked with the UN? And with Doctors Without Borders in conflict zone. She speaks 7 languages?" The man who mocked her earlier asked, clearly stunned. Nabira looked at him and smiled gently. Then, with perfect pronunciation, she began to speak in fluent French. Je suis ici pour postuler à un poste, pas pour être jugé par mon accent. Si vous avez lu mon dossier plus tôt, vous l'auriez compris. Translation. I'm here to apply for a position, not to be judged by my accent. If you had read my file earlier, you would have understood that. The room fell silent. No more jokes. No more laughter. One of the interviewers stood and said softly, "We owe you an apology." But Nabira had already stood up. "I came here to offer my skills, not to beg for respect," she said. "You judged my voice without knowing my story. But my voice is what helped thousands communicate, in hospitals, in refugee camps, in courtrooms." She walked toward the door, her chin high. "I'll find a place where my voice isn't mocked but valued." As she left, the room stayed silent, ashamed. They had judged her on her accent, without ever hearing her truth. But Nabira? She walked out stronger than ever, because her voice, no matter how it sounded, carried power, purpose, and a world of experience. McKenna walked into the tall office building, her steps calm but steady. She looked around the lobby. It hadn't changed. Years ago, she had come to this same company, full of hope, holding her file tightly, dressed as best as she could. But back then, they hadn't even let her through the door. One of the receptionists had looked her up and down and said, "Sorry, we're not hiring today," even though she had an interview appointment. She remembered the way they looked at her, like she didn't belong. Not because of her skills, but because of how she looked. Now she was back. This time, she had applied under a different name, her full legal name. They didn't realize she was the same woman they rejected before. She didn't come for revenge, not really. She came out of curiosity. She wanted to see if they had changed. But the moment she entered the interview room, she saw that nothing had. The panel barely greeted her. One man looked her up and down and said, "You don't seem like someone fit for this level of work." Another chuckled, "We hope you didn't come here expecting much." McKenna said nothing. She simply handed over her resume. At first, they didn't bother to read it. One of them rolled his eyes. "Another hopeful with no experience," he muttered. But then one of the junior staff began to flip through the pages. Slowly, his expression changed. His eyes widened. Sir," he said quietly, nudging the person next to him. She's a senior legal advisor for the Ministry of Trade." Now the others began to read. The room shifted. "Wait, this can't be right," one of them whispered. "She's on the legal team overseeing public contracts." Another stared at the page. "This is the same McKenna who reviewed our pending export deal. The government contract we're waiting on. She's the one who has to sign off on it." McKenna finally spoke, her voice calm. "Yes, that's me. No anger. No raised voice. Just truth. I came here years ago," she added, looking around the room. "You didn't even let me through the door. Today you let me in, only to laugh at me again." They were speechless now. McKenna stood, gathered her papers, and looked directly at the man who had mocked her. "You didn't see my worth then. You don't deserve it now." She walked to the door, paused, and added, "Next time you decide someone doesn't look the part, make sure they're not the one holding the pen you need." Then she left, leaving behind a silent room full of stunned faces. No shouting, no revenge speech. Just truth, power, and the kind of quiet justice that speaks louder than words ever could. Aminata stepped into the shiny lobby, her shoes worn out and slightly torn at the side. She had walked a long distance to get there. Her clothes were clean but simple, and she wore no makeup, just tired eyes and a calm face. The receptionist looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed. "Excuse me," Aminata said softly. "I'm here for the interview." The receptionist didn't even look at the list. "Interviews are for applicants, not walk-ins." "I am an applicant," Aminata replied, holding out her file. The receptionist crossed her arms. "I don't think you're in the right place." Just then, a tall man in a dark suit walked past, flipping through papers. He glanced at Aminata, and suddenly stopped. He looked at her face, then at the folder in her hand. "Is that Aminata Diop?" he asked sharply. The receptionist looked confused. She's not. The man cut her off, rushing over and grabbing the file from Aminata. He flipped it open, scanned the resume, then turned to the others nearby and shouted, "Do you know who she is?" Everyone froze. She's the trauma specialist who led medical response during the border conflict. She saved dozens of lives under gunfire. She was awarded for bravery by the UN. Now the room was dead silent. Aminata simply nodded, her voice quiet. "I just came for the interview. That's all." She turned to leave, tired of the judgment, tired of proving herself. "Please wait," the staff called after her, rushing to apologize. But Aminata kept walking. She wasn't here to beg. She had already done more than enough.